Its program on nuclear war, environmental disaster, and Raytheon, and how they come together in the Ukraine. I'm Susan Mirsky, chair of MAPA's Nuclear Disarmament Working Group and co-chair of the Raytheon Nuclear Weapons Campaign. Tonight's program is sponsored by MAPA's Ukraine, A Time for Peace campaign and the Raytheon Nuclear Weapons Campaign, and also co-sponsored by the Twin Threats Campaign. Just a little housekeeping. We have two wonderful speakers, Richard Krushnic and Patrick Moran, who will present for approximately an hour, a half hour, and then we'll go to Q&A. Please feel free to put your questions into the chat or wait until the Q&A period and use the hand raised icon, I think in the reactions. Is that the reactions button there? Yes, in the reactions icon down there. During the presentation, please keep muted to avoid distracting sound. And you can keep your, we'll do the hand raised and questions until we come to the Q&A, which will be approximately a half hour from now. If you have a question about the process or getting into something, then do it through chat, please. This program is being recorded and will be included in a follow-up email to be sent to all who registered. So, tonight's program is just so important. This is something that both nuclear and people who are involved in nuclear disarmament have been working on, people who are involved in environmental devastation are involved with. What is happening in the Ukraine and how these come together in the Ukraine. And then, especially in Massachusetts, we see here what role Raytheon has to play in all of that. So, our speakers will lay out scenarios in Ukraine that could possibly lead to an exchange of tactical nuclear weapons and even to an all-out nuclear war. They'll point out the central role that Raytheon's weapons would play in these scenarios. Patrick Moran. Patrick Moran is a member of the Nuclear Disarmament Working Group of Mass Peace Action and chair of the Missile Defense Subgroup. He is a graduate student in MIT Laboratory for Nuclear Science, and he lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Richard Krushnic is a former real estate loan asset manager and housing and business contract analyst at Boston's Department of Neighborhood Development. He is a member of the Raytheon Anti-War Campaign and the Raytheon Nuclear Weapons Campaign, a member of Missile Defense Group and the Latin America Working Group. His latest article with Jonathan King is Looking to Sell Weapons, Military Contractors Push Arms Race with China. So, Richard and Patrick, I welcome and thank you so much for helping us make sense out of these elements. And I know you're going to sort of work, Richard, you're going to speak first, and then Patrick, and then Richard. So please lead us into that. Thank you very much, Richard.
Okay. Well, so the premise, in a way, the most important premise, I guess, is a thought piece. We all know the danger of global warming, this long-term danger that's we're already seeing begin to decimate our planet and those who live on it. We all understand the seriousness of it, but we face an imminent environmental disaster that's very difficult to imagine anything being worse other than total extinction. And that's the possibility of limited nuclear exchange resulting from the ongoing escalation in Ukraine, resulting in one side or the other, presumably the losing side, to resort to the use of tactical nuclear weapons. These aren't the weapons that we got under our desks when we were little, some of us, to avoid. Those were the intercontinental strategic weapons with these gigantic warheads of unimaginable blast size, 20 to 50 times bigger than the Hiroshima bomb. No, these are weapons that might have blast forces much smaller than the Hiroshima bomb. But unlike the previous generation, which had very bad accuracies at these long distances, the new generation has pinpoint accuracy. So you can take out almost any target you want with utmost confidence, with relatively small collateral damage, unless that is you're dropping the bomb on a military target that's in a city. If it's a city, then the burning of the city results in so much soot and particulate matter in the atmosphere that thanks to our own Ira Helfsland and Robux and other colleagues, we now know that limited nuclear exchange of only 100 Hiroshima-sized bomb hitting urban areas would produce a global winter for 10 years on the entire planet Earth that might cut agricultural production in half and probably the population by a fourth or a third. So what do you want for an environmental disaster? Not bad, huh? I mean, that's pretty hard to beat in any pessimistic environmentalist's handbook. And this is not well, it is actually a long-term threat as long as these weapon systems are around and somewhat crazy people are in control of them. But it's an imminent threat. And I'd like you just to consider the proposition that the greatest environmental threat that the world faces today at this point in our history is not global warming. It's nuclear war and the environmental disaster that results even from a small, limited nuclear war. So we're going to explore the war in Ukraine, where it's going, how current pathways of escalation lead increasingly to the use of tactical nuclear weapons and what that might mean, how it might happen. Raytheon's importance in the war so far, which is enormous in missile defense, and Raytheon's role in the next generation of nuclear weapons, just simply pointing out that as one of the big four military contractors, it benefits with or without nuclear war to some extent, at least on its bottom line. And it's benefiting greatly right now with all the missiles it makes. It has new contracts, building new factories to ramp up production, all that kind of stuff. So these are the things we're going to explore, and I'll begin. First, whether you think that the US should come out on top or Ukraine should come out on top in this current struggle, or that Russia should come out on top and has legitimate concerns, regardless of how you conceive of that, it's important. It's almost like, regardless of whose side you're on, or if you're on anybody's side, it's important to understand that and we're not told this, so we have to understand it. It's the truth. From Russia's point of view, having Ukraine in Ukraine is an existential threat, a threat to their very existence as a nation. I personally think that's an accurate perception on Russia's behalf. But whether you agree with it or you don't agree with it, please accept the fact that that's how Russia sees it. That's what's defining their behavior, their objectives in the war, why they invaded the Ukraine, and why they would use nuclear weapons if they perceive that they're losing that war, because they think that their very existence as a nation is at stake. How could they think that? Well, we said we wouldn't expand NATO. We did. And now it expanded so much that there's a handful of countries right on Russia's border. But that giant 1,300-mile Ukrainian border is in the middle of those countries, and that would be unacceptable. The U.S. already has missiles on the Russian border in Romania and Poland. You know, there's plenty for the Russians to worry about. We can all remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. And we also must remember that figures such as William Perry, former Secretary of Defense, the immortal Henry Kissinger, who we just witnessed being the only American that the Chinese are willing to talk to at the age of 100, and Sam Nunn, decades-long chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee, Cold Warriors, everyone, all telling us that we are in far more danger of a nuclear war now, certainly than since the missile crisis, and to some extent even considering the missile crisis. This is not just a bunch of MAPA lefties worried about problems like this. These are the Cold Warriors, the preeminent Cold Warriors themselves, who are telling us the importance of what we're talking about tonight. And just keep that in mind, the long-term global warming threat versus the imminent nuclear weapons environmental disaster. They're so different, but yet they're both the giant environmental threats. That was from Russia's point of view. This is from the US point of view. We don't hear this at all in the news, not ever. We do in the alt press and the left press or something like that. But in my view, what's going on in the world today is this is the last ditch effort of the United States.
That's a very specific choice.
Oh my gosh.
To try to extend this unipolar period of US dominance for another decade or two. They know that it's inevitable that the integration of the Eurasian continent will make the US more of a bit player, but they're not willing to let it happen on their watch. And they're willing to go to the edge of nuclear war to try and extend this period of US dominance. They know it's slipping away. We all know it's slipping away. And since the war, since 2022, it started slipping away a lot faster with countries steering away from the dollar. The US was so desperate. There is no other candidate that makes as much sense as the US for who blew up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. With Western Europe already 40% dependent on Russian gas, if those other two pipelines went online, it would be game over. They'd be so dependent on cheap Russian gas. Now they have to buy 3 times as expensive US gas, and it's making the European economy non-competitive. The Europeans are the second victims of this war that the US is pushing in order to weaken Russia. And the US has to weaken Russia because it can't take on Russia and China at the same time. So the only hope for prolonging this period of US dominance is to weaken Russia enough that you can kind of just take on China without having to worry too much about Russia. That's what the US is in this war for. They're trying to weaken Russia down to the last Ukrainian. So those are the two sides. Russia thinks it's defending its very existence. The US thinks it might be able to extend its period of global dominance for a little longer. Now we're going to shift, and Patrick's going to tell us about Raytheon's importance in the war so far. And before that, I just want to lay out this one scenario, which is appropriate for what he's going to talk about. One of the likely scenarios I think it's more likely that there'll be a negotiated settlement. I don't think there's going to be a nuclear war. Personally, I watch several channels daily. I have for a year and a half. I know pretty much what's going on the battlefield. It's not what we're being told. And really, there's only one thing you need to know. Russia has 5 times the artillery and 5 times the artillery ammunition. In a war of attrition, that's what's happening over there. And the Ukrainians are getting ground up. I don't know if they can hang on long enough, another year or two, before this next wave of increased military production starts sending them stuff. I doubt it myself. I think negotiation is going to happen and Russia will get some of what it was looking for, and there could be a durable negotiated peace. We're already hearing the rumblings. Okay. But on the battlefield, in the hardware field, in the fighting field, we are not there. That's beginning a little bit, but we're still on the escalation track, which leads in the use of tactical nuclear weapons. And there's one more wave of that escalation that's more important than any other that could lead us to nuclear war. And that is, Raytheon's already the biggest provider of the anti-missile, anti-air, the air defense, the missiles that shoot down Russian drones and missiles and planes and all that. Well, there'll have to be many times more coverage of air defense. And there'll have to be F-16 jets and other compatible aircraft and pilots that know how to fly them, and all the Raytheon offensive missiles as opposed to the defensive ones so far that these planes will carry. Only all of that would maybe turn the tide against Russia. And if that happened, Russia would use nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons. And what would the response be? They would blow up, maybe they'd blow up 5 of the biggest military facilities, and 2 of them might be in cities and produce a lot of smoke and soot. Well, that's not going to cause a nuclear winter, but what's the US going to do in response? How easily can that extend to the point of where you have 100 Hiroshima-sized warheads going off over urban areas? A lot of military stuff is in urban areas. That's a possible scenario. And Raytheon, of course, is, it's got the contract for the new air missile, the air part of the triad. There's the new sub-missiles, the new land-based missiles. Raytheon has the new long-range nuclear air missile that would be fired out of an aircraft. It's key in all of the nuclear missiles, the Trident submarines, the Minuteman missiles. It has big pieces of the guidance and control and the communications in all those systems. It's sort of pièce de résistance, as it provides the global hardened nuclear war-fighting network communication systems that are supposed to be hardened and capable of operating in a nuclear environment. How's that? So Raytheon is deeply involved in all levels of it. So now we'll get down to some of the more little factoid parts of the puzzle, of the military-industrial complex puzzle, and Patrick will enlighten us.
Thanks, Richard. Great. So like Richard said, I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about the role that Raytheon is playing, what kind of systems that they're sending, or that the U.S. is sending, that are developed by Raytheon to Ukraine to help them fight this war. Just to give an overview, so Raytheon does provide the core of Ukraine's air and missile defense, along with other contractors, but I would say Raytheon is primary among them. Ukraine did have, for missile defense, they did have some older Russian systems, some S-300 and S-200 systems, but many of them have been destroyed by the war. And Raytheon has filled that gap, and I'll talk later about what those systems look like. In addition, Raytheon has won billions of dollars from the U.S. government in contracts for the procurement of these systems, which is all coming out of your pocket, our pocket. And Russia, as Richard alluded to, this is a provocation from Russia's point of view. So just to quote Dmitry Peskov, who's Putin's press secretary, earlier this year, he said that the tendency to pump weapons, including heavy weapons, into Ukraine and other countries, these are the actions that threaten the security of the continent and provoke instability. So I'm going to run through a number of these systems here, just to kind of give an overview of Raytheon's involvement and give some concrete examples. So one of these is the Javelin anti-tank missile. These are shoulder fired, as you can see in this photo here with the soldier. You fire it from the shoulder, and it is used in defense against tanks, Russian tanks in this case. The U.S. has already sent at least 5,500, although that's an older number, so it may have been more. They do intend to send more. And these are developed by Raytheon, of course, along with Lockheed Martin, another major defense contractor. And just for this system here, to replenish the ones that they sent, these 5,500, they received a contract back in May of last year to the tune of $309 million to manufacture some more of these. And these have become kind of a symbol around Ukraine. This just kind of shows their prevalence, to the extent that there is now this very identifiable meme within Ukraine of so-called Saint Javelin. So some made-up saint who is the protector of Ukraine against tanks, and he wields or she wields a Raytheon Javelin missile here, and you can see these stickers on the streets and whatnot. So that's to defend against tanks, and then to defend against Russian aircraft and drones. Raytheon is supplying these shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missile. So you can see that down here. Similar to the mechanism is similar to the Javelin that I just discussed, but in defense against aircraft rather than tanks. And Raytheon received a $625 million contract at the same time in May of last year to develop the Stinger missiles. Also in their air defense package are these what are called NASAMS. These are developed in conjunction with a Norwegian company called Kongsberg, and that stands for the Norwegian Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile System. You can see a picture of them here. This is a photo that was shared back in November 2022 by the Ukrainian defense minister, applauding the arrival of this new system. And these fire a couple of Raytheon missiles. So one of them, the Sidewinder, the other called the Advanced Medium Range Air-to-Air Missile, or AMRAAM. And the U.S. is committed, by my count, to sending 8 of these batteries, and they've already sent 2, to my knowledge, and other NATO countries have pledged to send more. So Lithuania recently pledged to send 2 of these, which they'll purchase from Raytheon and send to Ukraine. And Raytheon received a $1.2 billion contract back in November of 2022 from the U.S. government. In addition, so this is another surface-to-air missile system called the Patriot. This is one of the more, I would say, identifiable missile defense systems, or more famous. And so these have been used all the way back since the Gulf War in the early 90s. And these are primarily used for missile defense, for short and intermediate range missile defense, but they're also used for anti-aircraft defense as well. And these are mounted on trucks, as you can see here in this photo here. And the U.S. has sent 2 of these Patriot batteries to Ukraine earlier this year. And Raytheon says in a Wall Street Journal article just from a few weeks ago The CEO says that they plan on sending 5 more by the end of next year. And the U.S. government has provided them with a $1.2 billion contract to accomplish this, to ramp up production for the Patriot missile defense system. Russia has taken notice of this. So upon arrival of these, the first wave of Patriot missile defense systems, the spokesperson for the Russian Foreign Ministry, Maria Zakharova, said that the U.S. has effectively become a party to the war in Ukraine. And Dmitry Medvedev, the former prime minister and current head deputy of the Russian Security Council, said that Patriot systems and any NATO personnel will immediately become legitimate targets for our armed forces, which would, in turn be a provocation in its own right, perceived by our side. A question that should be asked is, do these systems even work? And in the case of Patriot, at least, it is a major open question. Ukraine has claimed that they work spectacularly well. They claimed back in May that they shot down 18 out of 18 Russian missiles, including 6 of these they claimed were these new hypersonic missiles called the Kinzhal that Russia has developed. Hypersonic meaning that they move much faster than they move at Mach 5 or something like that. But the long and short of it being that they're much more difficult to defend against with missile defense systems. But Ukraine claims that they defended against all of them with perfect effectiveness. There were some commentators praised this. They said that the issue of missile defense, which is an engineering problem that has been tackled for decades now, has finally been solved, and Russia's in big trouble now. But there were some other commentators that were a little more skeptical, a little more measured in their analysis of it. So Jeffrey Lewis was one expert. He's an arm control expert, and he had this thread on Twitter where he says, in response to this claim of shooting down all these missiles, he says, there are 3 separate issues here. Do we take the Ukrainian claim to have downed 18 targets at face value? Is it likely? And does Patriot make a meaningful contribution to the defense of Ukraine? My answers are no, not likely, and still maybe. So I would say this is an open question, and it's worth noting that similar claims were made during the Gulf War, that the U.S. These Patriot systems shot down 45 out of 47 Scud missiles from Iraq, and this was further analysis later showed that number was much, much lower. And that's talking about Scud missiles, which are, compared to these hypersonic missiles, are a lot easier to defend against. Granted, this was an older Patriot system, but still. And yeah, this is another headline from a few years ago before the war in Ukraine. Patriot missiles are made in America, but they fail everywhere. So with this in mind, and given the price tag that's put on this, and the risk of escalation with Russia, the fact that they might not even work, it's like, is it even worth it to be sending them in the first place? Something to consider. So that's the Patriot. The Aegis forms another part of this missile defense ecosystem. So that is developed by Raytheon. So Raytheon develops the Standard Missile 3 that is used by the Aegis ballistic missile defense system. And this is a ship-based system. So whereas Patriot is mounted on trucks and is moved around and based on land, Aegis is based on the sea. And so it can be used anywhere around the world, basically, where our warships can get to. Just recently, there was a test between Japan, South Korea, and the U.S. testing out these Aegis ballistic missile defense system in the wake of this North Korean ICBM test from just last week or 2 weeks ago. But there is also what's called Aegis Ashore. So whereas Aegis is a ship-based missile defense system, Aegis Ashore is a land-based variant. So It's the same system. It uses the Standard Missile 3s from Raytheon, but instead of being mounted on warships, they're based on the land. And two places where they are currently deployed are at NATO bases in Romania and Poland. So we're talking Eastern Europe, fairly close to Russia, right on the border with Belarus and Ukraine. And so, yeah, the U.S. Spent $800 million for this Romanian one, and probably similar for the Polish one. But Russia has seen this as a provocation, as with these other systems, and they allege this is a violation of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty that the U.S. did withdraw from back in 2019 under the Trump administration. But it's particularly galling to the Russians because the U.S. under Obama were also claiming that the Russians were violating the INF Treaty for doing basically the same thing. So the INF Treaty, it bans the development of ground-based intermediate range missiles, which is essentially what this Aegis Ashore system is. So we sometimes like to use this term missile offense because I think the term missile defense is maybe a bit of a misnomer, or it can be misleading, and it can lead to some, shall we say, myths or misconceptions about what missile defense is. I think a lot of folks think missile defense and they think, well, offense is an issue, and offense is provocative and belligerent, but missile defense is, it's protecting people. But I think for two reasons, they can be seen as more offensive than just strictly defensive. And the distinction is a bit blurred when you're talking about missile defense. So the first of these is the fact that any effective missile defense or any kind of defense, air defense as well, that is able to defend against a retaliatory strike enables the country that has this defensive system to launch offensive strikes at will without fear of retaliation from the country that they are attacking. And this is a fact that is well understood by the US and Russia and nuclear strategists. It's a basic principle underlying the nuclear strategy that underlies the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. This was a treaty between Russia and the United States, basically limiting the amount of anti-ballistic missiles that could be used to protect against intercontinental ballistic missiles. The reason being, like I just said, if a country is able to develop defense against an ICBM, they're able to launch ICBMs themselves without fear of retaliation from Russia, or vice versa again by US. The other reason why we call this missile offense is because these defensive systems can sometimes be converted quite easily into offensive weapons. So just to take the example of the Standard Missile 3 that I just mentioned, that's used by this Aegis Ashore system. So these SM-3s are launched by what's called the Mark 41 launchers. And these Mark 41s, the Mark 41s themselves are developed by Lockheed. They were developed by Raytheon, but they're manufactured by Lockheed. But they are also able, in addition to these SM-3 ballistic missile defense rockets, they're also able to launch these Tomahawk cruise missiles, which are offensive weapons. These are not defensive weapons like the SM-3 is. And the Tomahawk itself, it can be nuclear tipped or it can't be, but it is nuclear capable. And the Tomahawk itself is developed by Raytheon too. So you've got this whole, this whole slate of missile defense, but also cruise missiles and the launcher and the launchers, they're all developed by Raytheon. And this is just this is a photo from a catalog for the MK-41 from Lockheed Martin, and it basically shows what I just said. So this MK-41 launcher, it can be used for a number of purposes. It can be used for ballistic missile defense with the SM-3, but it can also be used for strike warfare with the Tomahawk cruise missile. And just recently, too, talking about using defensive weaponry as offensive weaponry. This was an article just a couple of days ago in Forbes where Ukraine is using their missile defense systems to launch missiles at Russian cities along the Black Sea. Now, they're not using Patriot or anything that I mentioned before. They're using these old Russian S-200 systems, which they've converted into a surface-to-surface missile system. But it's conceivable that the same could be done with Patriot as well. And this kind of underscores what I just said, but this is a quote from Anatoly Antonov, the Russian ambassador to the US. He wrote in an article in Foreign Policy in December of 2021, the result of the US withdrawal from the anti-ballistic missile treaty was Russia's forced decision to develop, the decision to develop hypersonic weapons that can penetrate any missile defense system in order to maintain strategic stability. So he's basically saying that, referring to the arms race that is brought about by these missile defense systems. Now they keep telling us that the Russian weapons are creating a dangerous situation. This is despite the fact that defensive American Mark 41 launchers, which are located in Romania and are to be developed in Poland, can be adapted for launching offensive Tomahawk strike missiles. When we express concern about this, we are told, in effect, just trust us. So that's all I have, Richard, if you wanted to continue with your remarks.
All right, so just reflecting on where we've been in this little discussion, how serious of a possibility is this that we could end up in some kind of a nuclear exchange, and what might it mean? Most people that I hear talking about this talk about the scenario if Russia's losing, they'll use tactical nuclear weapons and risk even a larger nuclear exchange because they feel that it's an existential threat to their very existence as a nation. That's what they think, rightly or wrongly. And we have, I think, every commentator or analyst that I hear about, even people who are, very, very pro-Ukrainian, they say take Russia at their word on this. That is how they see it, and they will do it. So we know at least that that is one scenario that could lead to a nuclear exchange with unknown results. Now, I've read that all the U.S. war games where tactical nukes are used on the battlefield end up in a very large nuclear exchange, far larger than what I was talking about, a limited nuclear exchange of 100 Hiroshima-sized bombs that on urban targets can bring about global warming. Most of the war games end in a more of an all-out nuclear war. We're not talking about global warming that eliminates a third of the population in over 10 years. We're talking about more like extinction of who knows how many species on the planet of plants and animals. That's what more of a big nuclear war. We now know enough to know that that's it certainly is a war that no one wins. Well, what about another scenario? What if, as I think is quite likely, in fact, that the Ukrainian army begins to collapse, and then it's either the U.S. side has to start using tactical nukes, or you just negotiate a settlement in which Russia gets most of its gains, which is not taking over Ukraine. It's hanging on to the territory that they've captured so far, about 20% of Ukraine. And they've accomplished a lot of their effort. One of their primary effort was demilitarization of Ukraine. Well, they're doing an extremely good job of demilitarizing Ukraine. There isn't that much of the Ukrainian military left, and of the infrastructure that supports a military in conflict. They may not get everything they would want on a neutral Ukraine, but it would certainly be a largely neutralized Ukraine in any event. And I think that that's probably the most likely scenario. Is the US crazy enough to use nuclear weapons if they're losing very badly and Russia's getting all that it wanted? And remember, it doesn't want to take over all of Ukraine. It would love to have a friendly government, of course, in Ukraine, but there's no thought or desire to actually militarily invade all of Ukraine. As far as the military part is concerned, they might like some more territory than they have now, but they don't have to have that to accomplish their basic objectives. But what if the US is losing badly? Are the leaders in control of this? Does it make that much difference to them to hold on to this US preeminent position for another 10 or 20 years? Personally, I don't believe that the people in control here are fighting for freedom or fighting for democracy versus totalitarianism. I'm sorry, that's not what I see. What I see is a government that is primary responsibility is to look out for the interests of US-based multinational corporations and what they want. But unfortunately, the primary and most forceful lobbying comes from the military-industrial complex. It comes from the military companies. It comes from, as we discussed in the article that was mentioned that we just did about Cold War with China. It comes from the lobbying of the military companies. Right now, Raytheon is preeminent among them, lobbying for preparing for the Cold War with China. Nobody says we want a war with China. They say we want to defend ourselves against the rise of China, the threat of China, China taking over the world. We want to defend ourselves. We want to prepare to defend ourselves. We want to prepare for a likely Cold War with China. And in order to do that, you have to do ABC. And of course, that's the self-fulfilling prophecy. Everything's oriented toward preparing for the war with China. And where does preparing for the war with China lead if that's your only foreign policy focus? It leads to war with China, doesn't lead anywhere else. So the military companies do this. All the think tanks that they fund, they develop the policy, they sugarcoat it this way and that way, they push their policies in Congress, and that's how the system works. And nobody does it as good as the military companies and the think tanks that they fund. So who wants to go to the brink of nuclear war in this war in Ukraine? Well, we do know some people who want to go to the brink, and they include preeminently Raytheon among them. So what does this lead us in terms of action? Well, if anything, I just hope that somehow, to the extent that this line of thinking is useful, I hope we can figure out a way to use it a little bit to improve our relations and coordination with the groups who are focusing on global warming and the environment, and to get a little airtime for the imminent threat of a more total and sudden environmental devastation that counts just as much as what would be done from the long-term threat of global warming. So that's it for me. I don't know if you want to say a few words in parting before the discussion, Patrick?
No, I think we can open it up to Q&A.
Okay, I just want to say thank you very much, Richard and Patrick, for weaving together these issues and talking about how perilous these times are for both the in terms of nuclear war, of the use of nuclear weapons, and environmental devastation, and who profits from the weapons making, and also the real dangers. So thank you both very much. I just want to say, please all keep alerted. We have a follow-up program to this with both our great presenters, Patrick Moran, Richard Krushnic. This will happen in September, I think either the 7th or the 14th, and it will be about missile defense. So please stay tuned for our next program. Next, I want to introduce Paul Shannon, who will be doing the Q&A. Paul is the coordinator of the Ukraine campaign, and he's the co-coordinator of the Raytheon nuclear weapons campaign. Paul, take it away.
You're muted.
Thank you, Susan. I want to get right into the questions since we are running a little late and I know people have plenty. But I do want to encourage everyone, especially if you're in Massachusetts, to get involved with our Ukraine campaign. It's called Ukraine, A Time for Peace, in which in a number of ways we're supporting the idea of a ceasefire and negotiations as an alternative strategy from the one presently being followed. Please consider joining our campaign. I'm put this link to a form where you can sign up for the campaign. We'll let you know of actions coming up. We're trying to build on a developing international consensus that this war does have to end. It has to end now. And the path to that ending is a ceasefire and negotiations. And we're hoping that that strategy can unite people from many different perspectives on the Ukraine war. So here is the link to that. I'd encourage anyone who is willing to get involved with us. Just means to be kept informed, to come to whatever actions or participate in whatever activities that you feel like, because there's plenty of activities we're planning. So please fill out that form at your leisure and get involved with us. Later on in the program, I'm going to put in another link to a form that lists all the different Hiroshima activities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki commemorations going on in our area, so that you can see what they are, but also that offers you the opportunity to volunteer to work at a table that will be setting up at some of these activities to try to collect postcards to our elected representatives, calling for them to stop doing what they're doing, to take leadership in calling for a ceasefire and negotiations. So keep an eye out for that link. I'll put it in later on as we go through there. But I think we should get right into questions right now. So if people, let me just see. I see we have a bunch of hands already here, Cole. Let's start with let's start with Louise Coleman. Can we unmute Louise?
Is that okay now?
Yeah, we're all set.
Okay. One of the things I was curious about, just has anybody in the media or in business or anywhere ever sort of, maybe not confrontationally, but just said to like the people at Raytheon, the powers that be and the executives, like, how do they think that this is going to keep going on forever and ever and ever? And it just seems like totally delusional that they're building more and more weapon systems, and that by doing that, it sort of heightens the whole possibility that it's just going to there'll be like an accident, there'll be a miswhere, something really horrible will happen. I mean, how do they think that they're going to spend their money if they're dead? Maybe they think that that never would happen. But has anybody, I've never really seen any kind of article or anything where people like just ask these executives, like, how do you think it's totally delusional? I mean, how do they think that they're going to be able to keep doing it? It's like playing with fire and thinking you'll never get burned, especially when you don't wear gloves or anything. I mean, it's totally, it's like a communications question.
Okay, thanks, Louise. Richard, Patrick, are you interested in responding to that?
I'll take a crack. People shape their paradigms, their worldviews, largely, unfortunately, based on their own relatively narrow self-interest, or as they perceive the self-interest of their bubble, the people that they associate with at work and at play and so on. And when you've had a successful run since World War II at being successful making weapon systems and lobbying for more of them and more expensive ones, you keep, the U.S. has stayed on top pretty much for a long time. You're making more and more money and so on and so forth. It's pretty easy to, you can say the same thing about what's going on right now on the battlefield. I mean, the U.S. continues to act as though they have more power than they do. Comments about U.S. hubris are absolutely true. They're absolutely accurate. And we know this from previous wars. We know this from the Vietnam War. The general on the battlefield tells the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the president what they want to hear. And that's the way. That's my explanation of how they can think that not just the military companies, but all of them, Blinken and Biden and
Right. It's just that it's delusion is denial is the least effective defense mechanism.
Let's go to another question from William Root.
Okay. Thank you, Richard.
William, are you there? There you go. Okay.
Muted now?
Okay.
Okay.
Go ahead.
We hear you. Michigan, but I was born in Massachusetts and brought up there. Next month is my 100th birthday. And I have a few World War II veterans who is now still living. I served in the Pacific Theater, and as Dean Acheson would say, I was present at the creation of this nuclear problem. President Truman justified the atom bomb in Hiroshima as saving countless lives, probably including my own, in an invasion of Japan. The atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki without Truman's advance notice, knowledge. He was furious and directed never again. Now, for the next 3 minutes, I'd like to explain what I think Truman would be saying today as to what he meant by never again. First.
Well, William, we got a lot of people in line here who have questions. Could you kind of focus on the main point that you want to focus on with what Truman said?
Well, that's all I want to say about Truman. The rest are coming from me.
Okay.
It will take 3 minutes. Is that too long?
3 minutes is kind of long. Can you shorten it just a little bit? But begin anyway.
Well, all right. I must say that no one nation can dominate the entire world. And this is addressed at the moment primarily U.S. hubris. The Romans tried, Napoleon tried, Nazis tried, the UK Empire tried. None of them succeeded. In fact, we didn't even succeed in Vietnam or in Afghanistan. More specifically, in addition to such abandonment of that hubris, we should pursue 8 subtopics. The United States and Japan should jointly publish statements that Japan would have surrendered based on the atomic tests on an uninhabited island, and the United States apologizes for its reckless and unnecessary first use of atomic bombs against Japan. The United States greatly appreciates Chinese statement, no first use. We hereby state, never again. The United States urges Russia and Ukraine to join no first use. The United States intends to honor its 1994 commitment to defend Ukraine and its signature on the Budapest Memorandum. I hope you can find the text of that. I haven't been able to, but there's a lot of comment about it. Next, the United States hereby abandons anti-ballistic missile programs. I was in the State Department when ABM experts testified that ABM cannot be successful because nuclear armed missiles can be camouflaged with hundreds of decoys. I've yet to hear a refutation to that. I asked the Undersecretary of State why, under these circumstances, the US was spending billions of dollars on ABM. He replied, quote, "We have to start somewhere." In other words, there was no reply. Reagan and Gorbachev would have agreed in Reykjavik to abandon nuclear weapons altogether had it not been for Richard Perle reminding Reagan of Reagan's support for ABM, which was anathema to Gorbachev. The United States hereby abandons its $1 trillion upgrading of its nuclear arsenal. We could spend months on that one. And lastly, the United States should immediately revive the Iranian nuclear deal. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, William. Those are many issues that actually Peace Action has been working on for quite a while now. So thanks for that list. Let's go to a question from Jake Aronoff, who's on the telephone. Cole, can you find him?
Yeah, I think Jake, I think to unmute, you might have to try *6. I hope that works.
Well, we're waiting for Jake to get on. Okay, he's on.
Okay.
He's
Okay.
unmuted.
Okay.
Yep.
Do you have a question?
Yeah. Well, yeah. How can we resolve the war in Ukraine and still give the Ukrainians a fair out?
Well, there's a basic question. Richard or Patrick, did you hear the question?
Yeah. Well, how can you give the Ukrainians a fair out? Well, what's fair? There was a coup in 2014 where a Russian-leaning president was overthrown and replaced by a Western.
Yeah, I know the whole history. Ukraine.
Well, all I'm trying to say is, what is fair?
Yeah.
What is fair?
Yeah.
I
They
think,
gave up the nuclear weapons arsenal in exchange for
Yes, they
security
did.
guarantees from the West.
Yep. And I guess it's fair to say the West has not honored that guarantee, I guess you could say. But on the other hand, there was a coup. After the coup, Eastern Ukraine began shelling the Russian part of Ukraine in the east. That's when the war began, not in 2022. It began in 2014.
Right.
And Russia, in varying ways, and defended the Russian population that was being attacked. So I think, and you already know what I think about Russia's fear of an existential threat, that I think that's legitimate. So what is fair to me is that Russia gets to keep its territorial gains. Ukraine, I don't think it has to totally demilitarize why should it have to do that if no other countries have to totally demilitarize? I
Right.
think that's an unreasonable Russian demand. But on the other hand, Ukraine has to stay out of NATO and it has to adopt a neutral foreign policy. To me, that's reasonable. And then, of course, both Russia and the U.S. In particular, if to be fair, have to bankroll the resurrection of the 80% of Ukraine that's still Ukraine. And that, of course, would be the hardest thing of all to achieve. It's much easier to forget about those who died in a war, in a proxy war on your behalf once the war is over. But to be fair, an enormous amount of resources from both sides would have to be devoted into reviving Ukraine after the conflict ends.
Okay, let's take a question. Thank you, Jake. I know, I understand, of course, that you see it quite differently. Question from Barbara Laxon.
Ask so much as I just West Peace Action. I just wanted to make sure that people were aware that we have a webinar coming up called Never Again, Remembering the Atomic Bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And we have several speakers, and we're also going to show a little film about what nuclear war would look like. So
When is that? When and where is that, Barbara?
that will be August 9th, and it's 8 p.m. And the event page is there in the chat.
Okay, it's in the chat. Thanks very much. Let's hope that goes well.
Thank you.
Okay. Now, next question. Let's see here.
Michael Hoey is next.
Michael, you've been waiting. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
By the hands, yeah.
Okay, the question I have, I've heard that the their military export industry has kind of crashed, that they were #2 up till a couple years ago, exporting weapons all around the world. But now that they're having trouble not only meeting their own demand, but it's crashed. Do you know if that's just propaganda or is it accurate?
I have not heard anything about that. My guess is that it's half true, because they're, they're involved in a war with the United States that has a military budget that's 11 or 12 times larger than the Russian military budget. So they probably need to keep a lot of stuff close to home.
Okay, but the truth is that the Russian military industries are humming right now. How that'll affect the economy is unclear, but they're producing far more than they've ever produced before. There was a good article in the Times today about this situation. I don't see any other questions. I'm going to ask one last one. First, I'm going to try to put this link to all the Hiroshima and Nagasaki events in the chat. I'm hoping people may find that interesting, especially if you'd be interested in helping out at the tabling of these events. But even if not, it's quite an impressive list of all the commemorations of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, starting on August 5th and going right through August 9th. So that link should take you to those. I hope you'll look at it. What would you say, Susan? Can I just ask one last question? I don't see any other hands raised.
It looks like John has his hand raised.
Oh, I'm sorry. John Palms. Okay, let's ask John what he's got here.
You're muted.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll try to be quick, but I've been thinking about nuclear bombs and trying to write about them ever since I was probably 13 years old, and I'm 77 this year. It just seems to me that what we did at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, those bombs, those were war crimes. We should not be able to do that to anybody. Now, the idea that there are useful nuclear weapons in this day and age, that was 1945. This is 2023. We're trying to trade with China as well as maintain nuclear parity or whatever. The things are just, I guess I'll get right down to it though. There are no tactical nuclear bombs. There are no useful nuclear bombs. How can you use one without hurting yourself? Who can you use one on? Who do you care so little about? That's really my fundamental question. It seems like that you can make them small, but you can't make them small enough. So that's enough. Yes. What is a useful nuclear bomb?
Thank you, John. Patrick, did you want to answer that?
Yeah, I was going to agree. And yeah, I mean, I posted in the chat the concept of a smaller nuclear weapon is all relative, because we're talking about roughly the size of the ones that were used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki when we're talking about tactical nukes. And yeah, I mean, even somebody like James Mattis, Trump's Secretary of Defense, said a few years ago that there's no such thing as a tactical nuke. And what he meant by that was that even the use of a quote unquote small nuclear weapon would have a devastating effect and likely an escalatory effect as well. So yeah, I agree. Yeah, I mean, I think this distinction of strategic and tactical nukes is maybe.
Well, can I just comment one thing on your language? A devastating effect. These bombs are weapons of mass atrocity, mass injustice, mass genocide. They're not just some bomb. Okay, it's not just a devastating effect. To use these bombs again makes us less than human. It changes the whole nature of warfare. Instead of military against military, it's if you rape my daughter, I'll rape your daughter. If you bomb my city, I'll bomb your city, and that makes it just fine. Well, I say you don't have the right to respond with a nuclear bomb. You don't have the right to have a nuclear bomb. So the smart thing to do is figure out how to disarm, and we might as well disarm unilaterally. But that, again, that's what I think. And enough of that.
Hey, well, John, Susan Mirsky is going to close us out right now. Susan is the chair of the Nuclear Disarmament Working Group at Mass Peace Action, which is working exactly for what you're talking about. Susan?
Right. So I thank you for talking about that, about the immoral aspect, unethical, immoral aspect of even the talk about using nuclear weapons. Thank you all for joining us. I just had wanted to add, Paul, in this discussion of military weapons, aside from the people being killed or displaced, we have to understand what is happening to the environment in the Ukraine, the land in the Ukraine, and what happens with the destruction of the nuclear power plants in the Ukraine. All a part of this terrible, terrible war, and what we are as a nation allowing to have happen. So here we are together trying to find a way to go forward and a way to address these issues in whatever way, on whatever level possible. Please, we've gone 13 minutes over, welcomed your questions. If you have more questions, please don't hesitate to send an email to us. And again, as I said in the very beginning, I'm sorry for those of you who didn't get the message. This is recorded, and you will all get a follow-up email, including this video. So thank you so much, Richard. Thank you so much, Patrick. Paul, for working on those questions, Cole for doing the tech, and for all of you who have joined us. Thank you.